Hello, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Raymond Nicolet Trust Podcast. My name is Gavrilo Nikolic, and every month I bring you inspiring conversations about the future of education, science, and philanthropy from world top academics, scientists, Nobel Prize winners, and philanthropists. My guest today is Dr. Ana Mijic. Ana is a reader in water systems integration and the co-director of the Center for Systems Engineering and Innovation. She is leading the development of novel system tools focused on quantifying the interaction between water systems and sustainable development. The work has aimed to inform regulatory bodies and water industry if and how we can support economic growth whilst ensuring sustainable water use and flood and water quality management under future uncertainties. Currently, Ana is the systems lead for the CAMELLIA Impact Program, where her work is focused on the development of systems water management models. These models can represent the integrated water infrastructure planning system and how gray and blue-green infrastructure solutions can be integrated with the land use planning and housing design. Models can be used to inform design and operations of water infrastructure systems that contribute to the overall quality of life in cities through concept of net zero pollution. If you're curious to learn more about Ana and the future of our water systems, you need to listen to this episode. In just a moment, the one and only Dr. Ana Mijic. Ana, welcome to the RNT podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Ana, let us start with basics. Where are you currently and what are you doing as we speak?
So I'm sitting at my home in London, working from home still, despite the governmental encouragement to go back. We are slowly going back. We're going to teach in person as we did last term, which is great. And it's Friday, so wrapping up the week and looking forward to the weekend.
TGIF, thank God it's Friday, which every employee can definitely not contribute to, but definitely repeat that saying all over again every Friday. So Ana, before we go into discussion on water systems and their future, which is a topic that is also quite interesting to me personally, let us go back to your personal history. When did you originally take interest in the water systems?
I studied civil engineering at the University of Belgrade long time ago now. The point during the studies which really determined what I want to do was the fluid mechanics module in our second year of the undergraduate, where I really enjoyed the lectures. I did really well in the exams, so that's quite an incentive for a young person. But I actually realized that what I'm really interested in is the interaction between the built and natural environment. And I think we're going to talk about that a lot today, because civil engineering and the traditional part of civil engineering is the way how we design our infrastructure, how we build, how we operate, how we manage that infrastructure, which follows lots of physical rules and laws, and we are very good in doing that. That's why we have the quality of life we have. But on the other hand, there is another side of the story, which is the environmental impact. And when I was studying, we learned about the kind of infrastructure and the environment in a very specific way of environment being the source of resources, and then we chunk all the waste somewhere downstream, and it kind of disappears from our eyes, and we don't really care about that. That narrative has changed a lot in the last, well, how long it's been? 20 years since I finished, and that is something that's really challenging for current and future water engineers.
It's quite interesting to learn where it all started. And it's quite interesting to me personally that now when we're talking about water, and we also had guests in this context that we're talking also about the water, are focused more on how we can make our use of water sustainable. So the next question goes in that direction. And I would like to ask you, what is the first thought that comes to you when I say water and sustainability?
Yeah. So this is probably the core of what I do and what we do here at Imperial as a part of research. And maybe just to start from the kind of big picture, and where I think the key challenge in sustainable development is really not an engineering challenge, which is very difficult for me to say as an engineer, because as I said, I think we are really, really good in making things. We are very good in operating and designing the systems which work for us. Would they be again water supply system, wastewater systems, or any other water infrastructure? What is, however, really challenging from the sustainability perspective is much more the use of that system. So I guess what will come under that category is the level of development, because any development will require supporting water infrastructure. It will require resources, and then it would also require, that we manage any discharge from water used, and it will also change the fluxes in the system. So depending on how we develop, there would be increased risk of flooding. So this is a really important point. Then the other thing is any kind of behavior change. So in water management, we talk a lot about the demand management, from the systems perspective, you mentioned in the intro about the systems work. From the systems perspective, demand is a really important, what we call leverage point, so something that can change system a lot. So if all of us would use less water, that would improve lots of things around the water system, but that's a very difficult one to influence. And the government is hesitant to manage that. I mean, water is very cheap, and most people don't think about it unless they get flooded or unless they want to swim and then the water looks really funny or smells really funny, and then they get worried. But on a daily basis, people don't really think about water.
I can fully concur to that, bearing in mind that is the commodity that has always been with us, and we are kind of we can always reach to it without even experiencing a shortage, at least in the European context. Obviously, it's different in other geographies, and we are sometimes not aware how blessed we are to have such a good systems that are working, but we can always make them better, not only for us, but also people that have some water shortages. In that context, I would like to ask you, how can we as humanity altogether get better at consuming water and reducing water waste, which is also something that is happening and not a lot of people are aware of that. And to be more concrete, what can a single individual do to support the transition to more sustainable water consumption?
Yeah, so this is a really important question, but really big question. I think the key there is to really try to understand for all of us is the complexity and interactions between the kind of water infrastructure systems, so that for any citizen, the fact that we can open a tap and have our water, or have a nice long bath, that water actually needs to come from some river or from some groundwater. Okay, so and then in that process there is lots of infrastructure in between, so there is lots of energy use, there is lots of chemical use to be able to get that water to the consumers. And then once we use the water, then from our mind it just disappears. But that water goes through the infrastructure system. It goes to the very heavily engineered treatment plants, and then it kind of goes back into the river, but in a relatively different condition than it was, and in definitely different location where it was taken from. Then again, every time we think about, for example, our front gardens, and every time we think about, do we want to put, we would like to have, of course, say, I need a parking space, so I'll just pave and I'll have a place for my car. But if we would all do that, then we would probably, not probably, but we will be under high risk of what we call surface water flooding. So understanding that, again, if I would, as an individual, reduce my water use, it probably won't affect won't affect system at all. But if we would all, if like 6 million people in London would reduce their water use from, say, average is now, I think, around 140, 150 liters per person per day, which is quite a lot, to something like around 100 liters per person per day. The consequences would be significant, because you reduce the amount of resources needed, you reduce the amount of chemicals used, you reduce the amount of energy used. And it's for all the infrastructure systems, from the point of abstraction to the point of discharge. So this idea and the notion that there is a propagation of influence of any decision in the system is really important. And I often get asked, like, should people care about that? And I think they should, exactly from that perspective, that the solution, there is an easy way to solve that. Okay, so if government would say, if government would introduce, for example, price scales. Okay, so if you use up to 100 liters per person per day, you pay this much. Anything above is really, really expensive. That would change the behavior. But that is that wouldn't be a popular move. There would be lots of pushback. And I think especially current government or in generally kind of the way how politicians think, they are very reluctant to make decisions that are not popular. But equally, I think if people would understand what would be the positive impact of such behavior, I think that would open many other avenues of incentivizing sustainable behavior, which unless that happens, or unless we come up with some technology that currently doesn't exist, fundamentally we won't change anything, because the world, the trend is the development trend, and I don't see how that will change. We have to remember, and I think you mentioned that, we, in the Western systems, we have a really, high level of water supply and high level of wastewater, treatment and so on. If you go, to lots of parts of the world, the situation is very, very, very different, and they are developing, and they of course want to develop, and it's really not fair to tell them, no, you can't have the commodity that the Western people in Western countries have. So the sustainable development debate is a really, really, really difficult one, because so many things need to happen at the same time for us to fundamentally change things. We can still change a few things at a time, and they will, it's not that they won't have any effect, they will. But if we talk about the big change, about mindset change, about fundamentally getting the world to the different trajectory, we are quite far away from that at the moment, I think.
Unfortunately, it's like that, but I always like to picture one example, and that is that a lot of people, when they're brushing their teeth, they just, open the sink, and then I think they use probably 1 or 2 liters per one brushing of teeth, and if they brush it multiple times a day, more than usually twice, then it's at least a few liters of water wasted per day, which I think it's a fundamental thing you can change. So you can always, close the tap, and in the end of the day, you would save some water, which is quite good. And also thinking where you can actually use the water or reuse the water in the best way. Like if you're cooking water for the tea, you can use it maybe later for some cooking, and also save energy. And in the end of the day, that's something that really amazes me, that people are not thinking about how they can make things for them better, because at the end of the day, we are all facing the hikes in energy prices, and they're happening because we're all at home, we're using more resources than we used to use before, and all the offices where we are not currently are still using the energy, and some people are going there, and they are using some of the water there. So in the end of the day, they're basically the prices that we need to pay double, and we're not using the space that where we used to consume all those goods before and then save them on our personal end.
Yeah, no, this is an excellent point. There is lots of what we call the waste of resources, and we're not talking just about the water. Other resources and so on. We work a lot on the different ways of sustainability. You also mentioned the water recycling, rainwater harvesting. So the systems for which technology exists, what rainwater harvesting systems are really simple to implement and really simple to manage. Even if you just want to use it, for example, for the outdoor water use, say something like irrigation, which is just a tank and you collect the water and then you don't use tap water for irrigation. They're very, very, very simple things. I think, why they're not happening is I don't know. I think people are, again, I think there is a level of awareness maybe that needs to be raised. What we do, we develop models. Okay, so we are modelers, and I think there is a huge value of making the most of the digitization era and the way that people are much more comfortable with different apps, different computer modeling and simulations, where we can show, again, maybe being on a very positive side, so not showing catastrophic scenarios, which we also could, but showing the kind of positive scenarios, in a sense. So if every household in London would have a rainwater harvesting tank, what would happen? If, we would all brush our teeth, what are the implications? And we are working on that. We are trying to now translate the models we have, which are the models that can simulate the whole of the water cycle. So really capture those interactions that I mentioned, to translate them in a way that the kind of data communication and visualization would be something that could be used for, everything from influencing policy, influencing operational change, so working with water companies, to working with organizations such as NGOs and citizens, and trying to create and support campaigns just for really increasing the environmental awareness. And I think, that won't solve everything, but I think we are sometimes underestimating the value of the information and information sharing, and how much the right information at the right time could change things. We see it up to a certain level. So I don't know, who is going to listen to this, but in the UK, there is currently a huge, political debate around the environmental law and the regulation, because UK has exited the European Union, and our environmental regulation has been set by the Water Framework Directive, which is the EU Water Framework Directive. We're still following that directive, but there is a consultation for that regulation to be changed. And one thing that is discussed and the focus is on the problem of the river pollutions from the combined sewer overflow. So discharges from the wastewater treatment plants, which are not treated. And they have a huge negative impact on the quality of the water in rivers. Water companies are not doing that well. So they have, for the last couple of years, 10 years or so, they've been fined quite a lot, many times, for unregulated discharges. And now there is a huge debate and attempt to try to regulate. They try to get, I think primarily water companies to increase their infrastructure capacity to deal with the pollution. But there's also, so there's a big political interest, but there's also big community interest, because during the pandemic, people have started using nature much more and then using urban rivers for the recreation. And then they've noticed more that there is some problem with the rivers. They organize themselves, they got together with the NGOs, they collected some data, and now there is a website where you can have a look at the pollution incidents from the data collected only by the citizens, which is a really interesting, and it's kind of completely different way of understanding the water system and managing the water system. The power of community and the way how much they can influence political decisions, especially because I guess politicians, won't go too much against the public. I think that element is still to be, I'm going to say used, but under quotes, not use, but in a sense, make the most out of that feedback link or feedback loop, and really engage the citizens and educate them to at least push the government in the right direction.
That's quite interesting what you have mentioned. Just a couple of days ago, I watched a documentary on Netflix called 2040, I believe, where they did a study in which they showed to kids in one American school. So, for example, if you use more water, this is how more pollution you're going to cause. And in other school, they did not show them those graphics, but they showed them the same pictures. And you could definitely see that in school where they showed them, they started thinking more on a community level. So they're not saying you, me, I, but they were saying we need to do that better. And in other school, they were using much ingrained in individualism we all have in our Western societies, and that were part of the culture, or are still a growing part of the culture, compared to that level of community sense that is slowly but steadily growing across the world. And that's something that quite amazed me, because in the end of the day, sustainability and in general environmental protection is a team sport. So if the weakest link is failing to support us, we as a team are going to lose. So that is quite interesting. I just want to your great remark about how environmental loss is something that concerns us all, and if we do not stand up for it, then the policymakers, then they will never be able to agree on it, and they will never be able to propose anything, because they only think in 4 years term, and for them that's a long distant future that is slowly but steady also arriving to our doorsteps.
Yeah, I mean, I really like your analogy with the team sport, and I think this is spot on, because we also in our work, because we have the models that can again simulate different parts of the system, and I think this comes also to another point which you mentioned, like water and sustainability, which is the issue of the collaborative decision makers and governance fundamentally. Which is it's and lots of problems and lots of barriers to sustainable development do come from that. So in the UK, you have the UK Environment Agency responsible for the rivers. You have the water company, which is private in the UK, responsible for the obstruction and the discharges, so water supply and wastewater system. Sometimes even not the same water company is responsible for the wastewater and water supply system in the same city. They typically are, but not always. And then in between all of that, you have the local authority that is responsible for the surface water management. So if you think about the water cycle and how the water goes through the system, you have at least, 3 organizations that are responsible for different elements which are completely connected. So for any decision to be made at that water cycle level, they all need to agree. I mean, so they are talking to each other. So that's absolutely important to mention. But there really isn't a framework that will enable them very easily to agree, okay, this is the best intervention for all of us. Hence, we are going to do that. This is how it's going to be financed. This is how it's going to be operated. This is, maybe the shared responsibility or so on. That is really, I mean, that this doesn't exist, and that is a problem. The problem is also from the kind of very technical perspective, decision boundaries are completely different. So if you look at the way how the water moves through the, again, urban system, an environment agency would work around the boundaries of what we call the water bodies, which are linked just really where the water flows. But then you have the, for example, local planning boundaries, which are, council boundaries, which are completely different. So, and then you have the wastewater zones, for example, which have completely different boundaries than any of those two. And then, from the technical point of, data, simulation, exchange of information, it becomes, it's a big mess, if you ask me. We are really now, with the research and with, again, data and models, we are really trying to try to align the information and see what's the easiest way to exchange that information and provide evidence to show how things could be done differently. Again, I guess where the influence of engineering stops is basically on that evidence. But we work a lot with social scientists whose expertise is much more on the kind of decision making and policy and governance, really understanding, human decisions and how things kind of work, when people sit in the room and need to agree about something. And we also work a lot with the kind of data and computer scientists who can take the outputs from our model and really put them in a kind of visualization and the way that it's very easily digested and really can help people make different decisions. Because again, we always come back to that. I think fundamentally what would change the sustainability debate is that, in your team analogy, we all start playing for the same team. At the moment, it's still like, lots of individual players who all want to be the best, and the team doesn't work.
Actually, I'm of opinion that we can build that community spirit by focusing on using the advantages of digitalization, and that's gamification of all the apps, and competitive spirit, because what is ingrained in individualism is definitely competitive spirit, and you can use that so people in the end of the day could maybe start using less resources. I can definitely bet you that if you develop an app where you could compete with your neighbors if you're spending less resources and stuff like that, that will definitely change the mindset of people, because people like to compete, and if that's the area they believe they can be the best, they will be doing it. However, there is another challenge, or another, let's say, another, let's not call it a challenge, but more something that can hinder that process, and it is definitely the fact that people are now we are all living now in that bipolar world. People have bipolar opinions, and the other day you could have people who simply reject doing anything without the evidence, without even listening to the other side, and without even willing to agree not to talk about certain things, but to talk on some things on which we can agree. But those are, like, I think all of these questions that I just listed are $1 billion, not $1 million questions that we all need to answer in the years to come. Otherwise, by 2040, we'll be living in a completely different world.
Yeah, but I think equally, I mean, we should just, everything that you said is completely, I think it's completely, spot on. And, the human behavior, psychology, in the end, and how people do different things and decisions they make, from the politicians up to, kind of common citizen, it will fundamentally, in the end, determine, where we go next, isn't it? I sometimes get to be depressed in a sense when I realize that, but in a way, I guess we need to stay optimistic and believe there is a good in people, in a sense that, maybe the current global narrative around, that's what you mentioned, kind of very high level of individualism and this kind of polarization. I mean, we're now going into politics, isn't it? But it's all connected in a way. I really hope that will change. I think we've seen slightly a bit of that change during COVID. And this is also something that I keep mentioning, when people ask me about the sustainability, is that I think we should use the example of COVID as a positive example of how quickly things can change if there is a pressing need. I'm not saying that I wish anything like that happening from the environmental perspective, but I think if people could think about say climate change as a kind of long-term pandemic, which it really is, then maybe this I guess pace of change would be slightly different, because when we had to, we had a very good reason, of course. COVID, is still a pressing issue. Things change overnight. So me moved to working from home literally overnight. I delivered the whole academic year last year from this room, and it worked. It wasn't perfect, of course, but it worked. Students did get education. They were grateful that we could do that. The regulation changed. I remember, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, we've seen lots of, some people from, let's say, China wearing masks, and we were like, well, this looks a bit silly. Now we all wear masks and we don't even think about that. I think, I hope, and I really wish that I think especially on the kind of governmental level and the policy, they would be just a bit more brave to regulate the environmental management in a more strict way, setting the example for everyone from the commercial sector to the private sector to the general public, that we need to take this very, very seriously.
I fully agree with you, and the example you mentioned about COVID is definitely showed us that we're pretty much more resilient than we ever thought we could be, and that's an important message to send out there, because it's everything about the resilience. We'll always be able to adapt, but we need to agree how to adapt, because the current situation is not sustainable, and we see that every day.
I completely agree.
In your work, you are also developing water management models. What are these models, and how do you start your work on these? Why they matter?
In research, you typically have like people who do experiments and then people who do models. This is like a traditional separation, and somehow I ended up in the modeling team, why I think models, generally water management models, are really important is because, you know, if you work on water management as we do, what I'm really interested in, so I'm interested in, you know, how the system is physically connected, how it is operated, but then also, again, what we discussed, all the decisions, all the rules, all the policy that changes the movement of the water through the system. And when we started thinking about the kind of challenge of integrated water management, which is integrating that supply side, wastewater side, but also water quality, what we realize is although there are lots of modeling tools that can do different parts of that system, so there are exceptional tools like state-of-the-art models that can do river systems, that can do, say, wastewater systems, water supply systems, catchment systems, and so on. But there really wasn't a tool that could combine that in the way that we wanted to do that. So how we wanted to combine that is to keep some of these physical representation of the processes so that we can implement physical measures and changes to the system, but also have the opportunity to be able to represent the decisions and the rules within that model. And we also wanted to have a model that is relatively quick, so that we can run the scenarios and the and different options, possibly go into optimization later on. And then we also wanted to have the model that can do both water flow and water quality, which is not typically done within the same modeling framework. So we had two options. So we could either choose, pick and choose different models and then try to kind of couple them somehow, and that is done. There are ways of doing that. Or what we decided to do is just to start from the scratch and say, what are the fundamental principles of the movement of the water through the system? Really basic fluid mechanics, like second-year fluid mechanics, and then start linking things together. I was really lucky that when I started thinking about this, I started working with Dr. Barney Dobson, who is a postdoc working with me, and Barney was brave enough. Barney is a brilliant programmer and water scientist, and Barney was brave enough to say, well, let's try that. Lots of people, were like, that won't work. It's too, in a way, it's a very simple approach, but at the same time, there's lots of things to think about, which makes it maybe, more systematic than simple, I would say. And Barney did that. So Barney made our first model, integrated water management model for London. That was in 2019, 2020. And we ran the simulations. So we set the model, ran the simulations, and the first results were exceptional. Because how we validate our models, we compare them with the observations, any observations in the system. So in this case, we compared, or any other detailed models, that's the other way of validating. So we ran when we set the London model, we compared the supply side. We compared, for example, how we simulate the level in the reservoirs. It was very, very close to very detailed model, for example, the Thames Water is using. And then we compared the downstream with the water quality data, with the observed water quality data, and the results were equally really, really good. And we were like, this might work. And then we started just really playing with that model. So we started simulating options that we wouldn't be able to do if we didn't have that model. So we, for example, simulated option, say if you have problems with the downstream discharges and the water quality, but the same water company is also abstracting the water for the water supply. And if there is a problem downstream with the water quality, what the water company could possibly do is just abstract less in a certain periods of time, leave the water in the river, and basically that would dilute the pollution that comes from the sewer system. So we could, we tried that and it gave amazing results. So just that change in the operational control brought the benefits in the same amount of financing as you would, infrastructure alternative would be, building a really, really huge storage next to the wastewater treatment plant. So that was the beginning. And then since then, what we did is basically develop the modeling system, which is really like Lego blocks. So we have the models of every component of the water system, and then we have now that for the urban system, but also for the catchment system. Because the agriculture systems are really important, all the kind of upstream from the cities area is really important. And then every component can be modeled in a different way. So we have very simple ways of modeling, say, water supply system, or we have a bit more complicated way of modeling water supply system, depending on the application. And then basically for any system, we can now plug and play. So, you tell me, I want to model, Belgrade. We need to ask you a few questions, and we can, if there are data, of course, we can connect it. So we connect the physical components, we introduce the operational rules, we see if there are any, what's the regulation, and how you limit the obstructions and discharges and so on, and we run the model, and that doesn't take us too long to set up, which is also a really nice thing about the model. And this is what we call the baseline model. So this is the first view of the system, and then we see how well we perform. And then depending, then there is typically a couple of iterations and, to get the model right for the system we are simulating. But all the results we had so far, and, since then, so we now have the model for London, we have the model for Norwich, which is in North England. We have started modeling the catchment system. So we have the model for the Upper Thames, and also in the Norfolk region in the UK, we are starting modeling Manchester. All the preliminary results for now look really, really good, in a sense that we can have that information, which is really important for the integrated water management. So we can run the system and see, for example, what are the impacts of climate change. We can change any of those decisions that we have talked about and see how it propagates through the system, what are the implications for the flow, what are implications for the water quality. And I'm super excited about that. I think we have something relatively valuable, and where we are at the moment is working with different stakeholders in the UK. So we are working with the UK Environment Agency. We are working with the few water companies. We are working with the planning authorities as well, to see how the models can be useful for their decision making. So this is a really, really big next step. We are currently doing all that work. And if it turns out that the models actually are really useful for the real decision making, and they actually want to use them, for me, that would be basically, I can retire after that, because that would be, I guess, from an academic perspective, an ultimate prize, that some things that you do as a research, which usually end just being published and some bunch of papers that people read or not, actually might have some real world impact. And if that would happen, I honestly, that would be probably the cherry on the cake of my academic career.
Well, quite big plans and also quite big future ahead of you. So I'm hoping that over the next years we'll have an opportunity to discuss it again, and to see how that developed. I want to ask you how important actually the water infrastructure planning, or let's say optimization, is important for formidable urban infrastructure planning. But it came clear out of your question that it's quite important. But maybe just to reconfirm it again for our listeners, and to make sure that we underscored or underline that. So in terms of urban optimization, do you think that optimizing our water infrastructure is the key, or there are other infrastructures that need to be optimized before we move to the water infrastructure?
Yeah, that's really, I mean, that's an excellent question. We talk about that a lot in the department. So I'm in the civil environmental engineering department here at Imperial. And I also, you mentioned, I have my second hat is the director of the Center for Systems Engineering and Innovation, where we really think about the systems engineering from the kind of different infrastructure sectors. And we talk a lot about that kind of, how do you integrate different infrastructure systems, particularly with the urban planning, which is the really interesting element, and then also different environmental impacts, because we talked a lot about, or I mentioned a lot of water quality. Of course, the other problem is the air quality equally. I mean, it has huge implications for human health. The narrative around the climate change is, and the focus is currently on the carbon emissions. I mean, rightly so. In the UK, the very popular concept is the net zero concept, in a sense, okay, we either will produce less carbon, or if we produce carbon, we're going to capture and store it, and it will disappear magically. I mean, we are still far away from actually implementing that, but I think what is really important here is that, we mentioned the governments, for example, UK government has committed to be carbon neutral by 2050. Whatever that means. I mean, I think it's a very difficult target to get, but I think the fact that we have a target is a really good thing, which we don't have, for example, for anything water related, and so on. So I guess, where do you start and how you do things? I mean, my of course, I would say, you need to do it all together. If we're taking a real systems perspective, it is very difficult, because again, we had talked about the things being done separately within, one connected system. Can you imagine, that you now have to bring in transport people, energy people, building, people, they all talk to each other, but planning the system in the integrated way and then managing the system in the integrated way is really, really challenging, because what you need to then ensure is the data. So basically the data that are used are shared, the kind of same data, especially the data that go across the systems, that the security is okay, that the data sharing platforms are there, and so on. And then all the mechanisms that need to be in place for the coordination. So I guess on your question, should we optimize? I think we cannot optimize anything because the system is very complex, but we can try to coordinate and try to look at at least key interdependencies between the systems. I mean, on the transport side, maybe interesting example and something we are kind of starting looking at is so the problem with the water quality and the listeners maybe if they read articles, they definitely know about the kind of microplastics and the plastics pollution, these emergent contaminants which are have appeared in the recent years. So, for example, from the urban perspective, there is an evidence, and articles came out in the literature around the appearance of the tire pollution, of the tire wear pollution within the water bodies, which then have the significant impact on the ecological species, on say fishes. And then when people looked at that in more detail, they actually realized what the problem is. So the tires wear, isn't it, as we drive? But then with the for example, the introduction of the electric vehicles, which are really good for the climate change, is that they're much more heavier. And what happens then is that actually this tire wear increases. And in that process, they haven't, when they were redesigning the cars, they haven't really thought about that. So basically what is happening is that more tire pollution is ending up on the surface, and it all gets washed off and, propagated through the, environment. So there are these lots, and I think this is, it's just one example of what we call in a systems approach, like unintended consequences. So you want to make things better in one sector, electric cars are okay, but then we should also try not to make it worse somewhere else. But how we go about these kind of cross-system interdependencies, I mean, it is very challenging, and we're thinking about that a lot.
That's a quite great introduction to my, not the last question, but one among last, and it's about water as a polluter. Would you say that water is a polluter?
No. I mean, water. I mean, when people think about water in a negative way, it's always about flooding, isn't it? So when we talk about water supply and drought, we say too little water. When we talk about the pollution, we say too polluted water. But then you will also have too much water. So when of course it could be from any sources, from rivers or from the overflowing of the sewer system in the urban environments and so on. And the problem, of course, with flooding is that consequences of those events could be significant. So we are talking about the huge damage. We are talking very often about human lives and so on. So it's a really important thing to be to deal with, and lots of especially in the UK, lots of money is going into flood management and flood protection programs, and different types of interventions around flooding. I think what is maybe interesting from that perspective, and if we see the flooding from the integrated water management perspective, then then what that enables us to think about the flood management beyond the traditional infrastructure, so beyond, say, embankments or flood barriers and so on. So we can think about how, for example, land management can have the positive impact of flooding, because fundamentally flooding happens because too much water is in the rivers, and the rivers cannot deal with that. So there's overtopping. So can we slow down the runoff? Can we infiltrate some of that runoff before it gets into the rivers? We can maybe think about some kind of coordinated management. So can we, I don't know, can we pump the water upstream and give more room for the water during events? I think for the flood management also, what is really important is the information, sometimes, especially in these large events, there is not much we can do, and the infrastructure is not designed for one in I don't know 100 100 years when it is, but like anything above that, it's probably not. But in that case, the flood warning is really important. So if we cannot prevent it, at least we can protect people, if not the kind of built environment. At least we can evacuate people and make sure that they are safe. So I guess this is the negative side. And we see the increase in frequency of flooding. We see the increase in the severity of flood events. But I think this is something that we just need to learn to live with and make sure we manage that as best as we can.
Once again, we are getting back to the topic of data and forecasting, which is becoming even more important than it was up until this point in our human history. And I'm just looking at my watch, and it's saying that we are almost at the time. Thank you very much for great conversation. Before we let you go, I would just like to wrap up our discussion with one very important questions, and I named it as follows: What are the three biggest challenges when it comes to making our water consumption more sustainable over the next decade? What would you say?
Yeah. So I would say, I was thinking about this. So I would say, I think first, and I think we talked about this, is the digital transformation. So there is a lot of data out there. We are not making the use of that. So making the most of data, getting, other data that would really help the understand how the system behaves, and then also using that data to operate the systems in the future. So we haven't talked much about the, how do we go into the future if we have those data and if we have the models. We are working a lot on something which is called the adaptive flexible design, so that you can predict the system, how the system behavior quite far in the future. But of course, the uncertainty is then very high because there could be multiple scenarios of what will happen. But then what is something that we would like to see happening is that, and we are working on development of those approaches, is that rather than making a decision of saying building a Thames tideway tunnel, which kind of is making the system, hopefully future-proof for, say, next 50 years, we do, makes the system future-proof in next 5 years, but then we monitor the change. But any intervention is designed in a way that it doesn't lock us in. Okay, so we can, build slowly, build a bit, and then use the data and models to predict, and then measure where we are, and then, adapt as the future develops, which again, it has lots of advantages. I mean, of course, the biggest financial advantage is because you don't have, you're kind of delaying the investment. But the other advantage is that you're very flexible in the response. So you can go much more into decentralized management and really target the interventions where they are needed most. So this is my first one. And I guess my second one is linked to that point around the digitization, which is really kind of thinking about what we call the smart and integrated systems. So the systems that have the multiple functionality, the systems that can be, maybe self-automated. So the systems that can, for example, so if you have, say, kind of storage of the local storage of the rainwater, and we have some green space there, how we can automate that system. I mean, maybe the implementation of all of the sustainability interventions, because there's lots of human element involved, maybe that it makes making them maybe more difficult to implement. But if we would have a systems of, say, local water capture, that system automatically then checks the water content within the green spaces. There's an automatic system that it triggers the irrigation and so on. It kind of maintains the green spaces. And then also, depending on the water quality. So if it's a good quality, it's a acceptable quality, there's no need for irrigation. It transfers that water into the drainage system. But, because that water is a really good quality, so you are reducing the cost of the treatment. I mean, there's lots of things that could be integrated in a very smart way if we would have the right, information and the models. And then my last one is something, again, we talked a lot about, is around the, coordination and the communication. The coordination really between different elements of the water system. There is a huge push, and I mean, about the integrated strategies in the UK and worldwide. I think we're still not there to really have the frameworks and mechanisms for that to become a business as usual. And I think it really should, given the scale of the problem. So these are the three things for me.
Thank you very much. Before we close, I would like just to ask you if you have any last words, anything else that you would like to mention that we did not mention. We mentioned a lot of big topics. We
Yes.
don't have time to go into details on all of them, but at least we gave our listeners a big picture about why water systems are important and how we can all get more sustainable, at least in our thinking about how we use water, and then to apply all the advices you gave along the way practically, at least starting with brushing the teeth.
Yes. Yeah, I guess my final maybe where I would like to maybe close this is just I think we talked about a lot of negative things, isn't it, and kind of challenges and so on. I would really like to end maybe on the more optimistic note, because I deeply believe we have lots of tools and lots of techniques, a lot of technological advancement, and hopefully lots of goodwill and understanding how we go forward. You mentioned kids in the school. I think the level of environmental awareness, amongst the younger generation, so I have 3 kids, is much higher, and they're much more conscious about that and much more worried about that. And I think that energy could get us into a good place. And I would, maybe if there are some younger people listening to this, I think if anyone wants to become a civil engineer and kind of water engineer, it will be a very noble role, because there's so many things that need to be done differently. It won't be easy. I think that they would need to learn much more than engineering. They would need to be also a bit on a data scientist, computer scientist, maybe sometimes a bit of psychologist as well. But I think if they get it right, they could really change the way how the world functions in a really good way. So that's probably where I would like to end it. I think there is a hope. I think we can get to a much better place, and definitely from my side and my research group we'll keep trying to influence.
There's always the rainbow after the rain, so I prefer that next to there is a light in the end of the tunnel, because in the end of the tunnel the light could be a train. So a rainbow is something more descriptive and better. Ana, just before we close, I would like to acknowledge you for constantly showing up for RNT, and also for a great conversation here today, and for explaining our listeners why water systems matter and how we can get better at consuming our water. Thank you very much for being also my guest and for a wonderful conversation over the last hour.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the great chat. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.